Thank you, Mr. President and members. I was happy to see one part of this bill that left, and if I'm going to ask Senator Makeway to yield in a second. One of the concerns I've had is about what happens in the long-term care side with nursing homes and assisted livings, and I think the cost of that is considerable. In the budgeting, I don't have a precise number, but it's certainly in the tens of millions of dollars a year on this industry. And this industry is dependent entirely on funding from us. As we just are wrapping up our Human Services Omnibus, that topic comes up a lot. And so if Senator Makeway would yield for a question, Mr. President.
Senator Makeway, will you yield? She will yield. Senator Abeler.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Senator Makeway, when this bill left the floor, there was some funding in there for the employee share of this of the paid family leave. Can you please comment about if it's still in there, and did that language or anything change in the conference process?
Senator Makeway.
Thank you, Mr. President. The money did not leave, but I will defer to Senator Mitchell to describe a little bit more. Excuse me, I'm sorry, Mr. President. To defer to Senator Mitchell to describe a little bit more about the rest of it.
Mr. President.
Senator Abeler.
Thank you, Senator Makeway. Will Senator Mitchell yield for a question?
Senator Mitchell, will you yield? She will yield. Senator Mitchell.
Did you hear the question? Did she hear the question, Mr. President?
Senator Mitchell, did you hear the question?
I did hear the question, Mr. President.
She heard the question. Senator Mitchell.
So I think this is one of the really wonderful things that we were able to do with this. I don't recall if Senator Makeway mentioned this or not, but one of the things that we have done in this is to take $668 million of our budget surplus and use it to help fund this program in general. So startup costs, money to get this off the ground so that that first year or two as people start to pay in, we already have a pool. So what we are doing specifically to the direct care workers, which Senator Abeler, I share your concern with this, is that of that larger number, $20 million is going to be directly set aside for that. Now, there is actually a fiscal note. I heard someone say that there wasn't a fiscal note, but particular to this subject, there is a fiscal note, and it looked at how much the nursing home rates would need to kind of offset this. So that would be about $200,000 is what the first year cost is, because it might be a partial year, and then possibly $1 million after that. So there's already a big pot for that to start drawing from in the first place, and then there is a commitment from DHS that those would end up being reimbursables going forward for the nursing home. So, and then the other thing with this is, and part of this is in the Human Services Bill, which I know you worked very hard on, Senator Abeler, which, Mr. President, I know that Senator Abeler worked very hard on. But there's also another, I believe, $90 million that is retention for those direct care workers that includes retention money, help with daycare, transportation, hiring. So the combination of the way that we are able to add in this paid family medical leave being covered and then also retain those valuable workers in other ways, I think is going to be a huge boon to drawing more people in to caring for our disabled, for our elderly, things of that nature. Because, you know, as we heard when this first came through, a lot of those workers happen to be female. A lot of those workers happen to be minorities. And so, for example, you know, Senator Gustafson told a compelling story about when she didn't have this leave, she didn't happen to be in this career field, but without having this leave, how she had to go back to work still bleeding after having a child, and how many women end up re-hospitalized after giving birth if they aren't able to take proper leave. Another story that Senator Mann told that was so compelling about her treating someone in the emergency room who had a job where they had to be on their feet, very similar to what many of these direct care workers have to do, and how that person had an injury that was going to take him off his feet, and he was crying because he didn't know how he was going to pay the bills. So I actually think that this paid family medical leave is going to be a tremendous benefit that will help people in the direct care, but both with the initiatives in human services and this committed chunk that is going to go to paid family leave, and also the fact that DHS has already done the analysis, that DEED has looked at this financially, and that if we need to put more money in at some point, we have a commitment to continue to do that. But I think all of those things really have this for our people who take care of those who take care of us in a really good position. Thank you so much for the question, Senator Abeler.
Senator Abeler.
Well, thank you, Mr. President and Senator Mitchell, for that answer, and covered a lot of ground in that answer, which is fine. And so I'm glad there's some money in there. I was just reading the bill. I'm just trying to figure out what it actually said. So maybe you can help me interpret this. And you singled out nursing homes, and I'm certainly concerned about their welfare. So I'll just ask, would she yield for another question, Mr. President?
Senator Mitchell, will you yield? She will yield. Senator Abeler.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't have the privilege of having the fiscal note here. I just have the language that's in here, and there's a lump sum of $20 million, which seems that it may be added to the base for all these 300,000 home and community-based workers. And there's nobody, I think the whole body here wishes they could somehow be covered by this. So, but the question is, Senator Mitchell, is that money you mentioned, the million something and all that, is that for the entire share? Or is that simply the employee's share, as I thought it left the floor with paying the employee's share? Has this now been expanded to cover the entire share at the particular nursing home? That's because she mentioned nursing home specifically. Thank you.
Senator Mitchell, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Abeler. So all of this is covered under Section 60, which is the Long-Term Services and Supports Workforce Incentive Fund Grants. So under that, the Commissioner of Human Services establishes grants for the long-term services and facilities to assist, as I talked about, with recruiting and retaining direct support professionals. Those eligible employees, that means organizations enrolled in a Minnesota healthcare program, includes providers of home and community-based services, facilities that are intermediate care facilities for developmental disabilities, nursing facilities, personal care assistants, first services, and there's a number of other things listed under that. I also want to add what this costs in general, because that is something I had wanted to speak to anyway, and I think it's very relative to this particular part of the conversation. But even if someone doesn't have an employer that covers the whole cost, or if they have to have a share, this breaks down to someone that is making $50,000 a year. And we do know these numbers because the United States is almost the only industrial country that doesn't do this. So we can look to other countries, and 11 other states are now already doing this. We're starting to kind of get behind on the fact that we should be doing this. But so we do have a lot of numbers. And so if someone's making $50,000 a year, for example, the breakdown is under $7. So if that was to be split by not someone covered under this, the direct care, which we already talked about, but split by an employer and an employee, we're talking $3.37 a week is the estimate. And so for an employer to say, you know, this is going to bankrupt our business, or we're going to have to cut other benefits, over $3.37 a week, I just have problems seeing that would be an accurate statement. But again, Senator Abeler, back to your question. Yes, we are doing things to both incentivize in this bill and in other ways all of those direct care facilities. And as I mentioned, there's just a whole list of direct care agencies that would be eligible for the grants so that they wouldn't have to pay for this, and DHS's commitment to make that a reimbursable if for some reason they did at some point.
Senator Abeler.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate both very expansive answers, which actually my question was much simpler. But I was looking for Section 60 in this bill, and there isn't one. And I'm just thinking maybe Senator Mitchell was reading to me the Human Services Section 60 in Senate File 2934. So maybe Senator Mitchell would yield for a question like, where are these grants that you're talking about?
Senator Mitchell, will you yield?
I will yield.
She will yield. Did you hear the question?
Yeah, so what I just read off was, I believe, Section 60?
Mr. President, there's not a section.
Senator Abeler?
There's not a section. Like, what page and line would that be, Senator? If she would yield. So, would she yield to answer?
She says she would yield. She's waiting to yield. She wants to just make sure that she understands your question.
Mr. President, where in the conference report of House File 2 is that section that Senator Mitchell is referring to?
Senator Mitchell, did you hear the question?
I did. It is
right.
Article 3, Section 11.
Article 3, Section 11. Senator Abeler.
Okay. Yeah, page 80. So, Section 11.
Section 3.
Yeah. It's actually Section 11, Mr. President.
Well, she said Section 3. Article 3, I'm sorry. Article 3, Section 11.
Yeah, well, okay, Mr. President. There's no detail listed on here, so maybe she knows something I don't know, but it says $20 million is added to the base appropriation to the commissioner to provide reimbursement for premiums incurred for the paid family.
Senator Abeler, can I ask that you move the mic up
yeah.
because it sounds like you're thinking out loud, but we want to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's not always good that our thoughts that we are thinking are out loud, so I appreciate that you can differentiate those. I am trying to ask a question. Thank you. So it says here that talks about $20 million, and it's for premiums, and it just says it's going to go through this community-based workforce incentive fund. Maybe that's what you were reading to me. But my question is this, and I wasn't hoping to get, your answer was fine, and people working should certainly be able to work and take care of their families and everything, which is the point of the bill. But so the money in here, the $20 million that starts in 26, which I believe is ongoing, does that intended to cover both just the employee share, or because that's where I think it left the floor, or is this also now cover the entire share for all 300,000 workers in this niche? If Senator Mitchell would yield and answer that question.
Senator Mitchell, will you yield?
Yes, I will yield.
And she will yield. Did you hear the question?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Mitchell.
And I would like to apologize because when I said Section 60, some of this specific language that Senator Abeler is talking about refers back to the Human Services bill because they're interlocked in how this money is going to work, refers back to that bill. So there is language in both bills. But so the employer versus the employee, this is set up so that all premiums are to be paid by the employer. Now, this is in general, who can then charge up to half of the employee. So just in general, that was that $7 off of, if a person was making $50,000 I was talking, and then it could be split, which was the $3. So the current language would have the employers seek premium assistance, and they can use that. So they can put in for that assistance, and instead of using that option to back charge half to the employee, they can have that covered. So in that case, then the employer of something that did the direct care would just pay the full $7, and then that $7 would be eligible for the original $20 million lump, or what DHS had said would be reimbursable. So by that way, the employee would not end up getting charged, and no employer has to charge their person under this. Again, on the $50,000, they could just say, we'll pay that full $7 a week because we want to do that for our employees who we value so much.
Senator Abeler.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and I appreciate the discussion, and I'm really not trying to drag this out, but it's actually raising more questions than I had. I just looked up Section 256.4764, and that section does not exist. And maybe it's in the Human Services Bill as a pending thing. So the pending number in the conference report's out, and assuming it passes that section, will exist. Actually, I was just interested, if that really is from that bill, it's interesting we're about to pass legislation that references a section that's pending in a different piece of legislation, and that's a whole different discussion that I'm not going to do that to you, Mr. President, to ask about that. That would be most curious. But if that's the case, that's kind of interesting. Because it says that's how you're going to maybe pass it out. But anyway, so just since you brought up that fund in the other bill, Senate File 2934, it's $90 million, it's one time, and it's available for all kinds of purposes to workers, and there may not be any money left in it by the time we get to 2026 when this is going to be needed. And we talked about it in conference, and it may take 6 months to a year to stand it up, and I have a feeling that money is going to go out the door quick because nursing homes and other places are in such straits. And so I don't know, Mr. President, and for the people who are going to implement this thing, you might want to figure out how this is going to work, because I think this is a gap in legislation which I'm not going to pursue. So, Senator Mitchell, the question I asked before, and let's pretend there's no other fund because it doesn't exist yet. Just out of the $20 million, is it the intention of the legislation to pay the employee share through whatever mechanism, reimbursement or otherwise, as the sole part of the fee of the tax? Is that what it's called? So the 0.7 to 1.2%, that the employee is bound but to pay half that, so 0.35 to 0.6. Is this intended to cover the employee share of this tax?
So you're asking Senator Mitchell to yield?
Mr. President, will Senator Mitchell yield?
Senator Mitchell, will you yield? She will yield. Did you hear the question, Senator Mitchell?
Yes,
All
Mr.
right.
President, I heard the question. I tried to follow the question as closely as possible. I feel how I heard the question was something I already answered, which is that the intention for direct care workers is that the employer would pay the entire, because the employer is going to get reimbursed. So they would not take the option employers have to split the cost 50-50. They would instead keep the 100% of the cost, and then that cost will be reimbursed. I hope I understood that question correctly, but if I did, that would be the answer.
Well, thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Abeler.
So I'm sorry if I'm dull today, but so I believe the answer to the question is this $20 million is meant to pay through a reimbursement mechanism, which is actually often delayed, the employee's share of this through a reimbursement mechanism. And so I believe then I don't want to drag this out, but so Senator Mitchell, it's not the intention of this $20 million to pay the 100%, but to simply reimburse for the employee's share. I think I've got that right. Then I have a question beyond that, but if you can just nod it's not the intention to pay the entire tax of a particular nursing home on this. It's meant to reimburse the half that would be payable by the employee. I think I said it clear. And you can just say yes or no if you'll yield, Senator Mitchell.
Senator Mitchell.
Yes,
Yes, you
to
will yield.
nod. I'm not sure what to do. Yes, the intention is to pay the employee share.
Senator Abeler.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so would Senator Mitchell yield again for a question? I bet she will.
Will you yield, Senator Mitchell?
Yes, Mr. President.
She will yield. Senator Abeler.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. It's nice that the committee can be involved in a human services discussion. That's always a good opportunity for anybody who doesn't get to serve on the committee. On line 80.24, it says it's added to the base appropriation. And so, Senator Mitchell, does this include, is this ongoing when it says added to the base appropriation, or is this $20 million added one time into that fund? If she will yield, Mr. President.
Senator Mitchell will yield. Senator Abeler. And Senator Mitchell, did you hear the question?
I did, Mr. President.
Senator Mitchell.
Hold on. Mr. President, so it is currently one time. Again, even though we have a lot of data from other countries and other states, we want to look at what would be appropriate for this. So it is currently one time, but the legislature can choose to make it ongoing in the future, because I know that once this gets going, there is an intention to do another actuarial of the first year to see what the actual costs are and if there needs to be any sort of a reassessment.
Senator Abeler.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And actually, I had read it wrong. I thought it was ongoing, and I appreciate that clarification because it left the floor as one. And so, on this motion to not concur, I think this really needs to be funded permanently if we're serious about this. To that point, I think it should go back and they should pay the bills that they're going to be having people incur. By contrast, Mr. President, I don't know if it's in this version or the other one, but the different agencies are getting money every year to cover their costs. Labor and Industry, Commerce, MMB, ironically, Human Services is getting ongoing base funding. Secretary of State, Supreme Court, and even the legislature gets something. I don't know if that's ours or for our staff. And the U of M gets ongoing funding. Mr. President, I do appreciate the discussion. I do want to point out something and why I think this should go back. And Senator Mitchell, I appreciate all your passion. And I appreciate very much, you have a way of bringing the humanity into it and telling a story about an individual or a family that compels me to want to support paid family leave as well, and to make sure that those individuals who are making $50,000 or less, barely getting by, want to take some time off to care for their daughter or sister or spouse or loved one or whoever, so they can care for them. But Mr. President, the way this is set up, given even the interactions with the current human services legislation that's before us, that this is going to create a $60 million additional expense into the system of all the whole human services systems. And so if you've heard Senator Hoffman say anything, that he felt the target was insufficient to handle the needs. This is going to if this covers indeed the share of the employees for 1 year, and then the costs are ongoing, there's $20 more million that has to come out of whoever the nursing home is and the other places. And then in the upcoming year, it's going to be $40 million. Now, Mr. President, we had a story about, Senator Mitchell had a really just compelling story, and I just makes me just feel happy that maybe there's something we can try to do. But, Mr. President, I don't know if you're aware that many of the nursing homes, group homes, day facilities, home care agencies, et cetera, are on the ropes. They're barely open. Nursing homes, 10% are on the verge of closing. 50% are burning into their reserves. And so in the budget bill that's about to pass, you'll be asked to vote on, there's $100 million in loans for nursing homes, $2 million for critical access, and then this $90 million pot to help deal with with all these fine benefits that would go to the workers. But, Mr. President, none of that is permanent funding except for $2 million for critical access facilities that's going to be increasing the funding of these places. So, Mr. President, what does that mean? As one of my superintendent friends told me, we're going to have better benefits, but for fewer workers. And so the story that Senator Mitchell told is accurate and will be helped by this. But, Mr. President, because of this impact of $60 million just in one biennium, and then $80 million bienniums going forward into 28, 29, and 30, 31, et cetera, there's no funding to pay for that. And it was the opinion of the governor and others that there was adequate funding in the nursing home bucket and in the home care, et cetera, buckets. And as a conference committee, we disagreed and put some significant funding into it. But there's not hardly a penny of new money going to nursing homes that they can just spend as though it's cash. When the bill left the floor of the House, of the Senate, there was ongoing money. And so it isn't as though these nursing homes are some big corporate empire. These nursing homes are run by local citizens in most cases. Most are nonprofits, and they're closing. And so the grief that Senator Mitchell's story talked of is real. But, Mr. President, the grief that a family experiences when they can't put their loved one, finding a bed for somebody who needs rehab post-surgery, or they have a stroke and they need somebody to attend to them 24/7. They've been helping their mom and they can't do it anymore, and they're looking for a nursing home bed. Mr. President, because of the impact of this very paragraph, where we're going to be taking $60 million of additional burden, well-intended and a good value, but without paying for it, then that adds burden without any opportunity to pay. And some of the very people that we are hoping to improve the lot of, that Senator May Quaid is passionate and rightfully so about, and Senator Mann, as I've heard her talk about, let's help these individuals. Mr. President, they're going to be unable to maintain the job that the person has now. And so it's one thing to be able to handle your own individual needs. It's something else to not even have a job to go to at a company that wants to help. And they want so much, Mr. President, that they are taking out loans and digging into their reserves to try to keep their system intact. And ironically, some of the loans that are in Senate File 2934, which have been referenced in this bill, the companies are so loaned up and they've mortgaged they've taken out personal loans to keep it open, they can't take out any more loans. They're forbidden. So this should go back, Mr. President. And Senator Mitchell and Senator May Quaid, and I know you mean well by this, but if you mean well on this industry, you need to find $60 more million, and then I would have had nothing to say on this bill, on this topic. But, Mr. President, it is not going to be adequate. Yesterday when I called up one of my facilities in my area that does services through disability, I said, good news, there's some good money coming to you in Senate File 2934. However, just so you know, there's a sick time thing, which is going to cost you about 2% because you don't afford that. You would like to. And then there's this nominally 0.5 to 1%. And she goes like, what? And so, Mr. President, you want to mean well. And as I read all these letters from the groups that are they're spot on, Mr. President. They recognize the need. They recognize the value. But it's really more like wouldn't it be nice, Mr. President, in college, that was one of my favorite songs by the Beach Boys, wouldn't it be nice? And so, wouldn't it be nice if? But then you have to figure out, wouldn't it be nice how? And the discussion we had on the floor leaving here was about this very matter, and it didn't get resolved in conference. And at a time when there's $17 billion of surplus, wouldn't it be nice, Mr. President, if we could fully fund the nursing homes and the group homes and the day facilities and the home care and the very core of what it is that we rely on for the needs of our elders and our seniors and those with disabilities? And, Mr. President, I'm not trying to be unreasonable here, but this has to go back. You need to find the money. We need to set a priority. There are so many elements of $60 million that have been squandered on things that are not essential, they're not important, they truly are nice. And so it's up to us to judge what's essential, what's important. Mr. President, this is essential. It needs to go back. Please, rejigger the money. I'm not in charge of that. Let's fix it. Thank you.